Hey everyone, it's Brian. Just a quick show note before we begin today. When we were recording this season 3, we were still wrestling with what to call the small, formative communities we often refer to that are helpful and even necessary in our journey into deep discipleship. We've referred to them as immersive communities of formation, or ICFs, and 5-element communities. Down the road a bit, around episode 50, we finally just decided to call them greenhouses. That's the term that stuck, and if you go to our website, you'll find lots of information on greenhouses. So as you're listening today, you may hear some of those old terms, such as ICF and 5-element community. If you wouldn't mind, just mentally substitute the term greenhouse when you hear those older terms, and you'll be all set. Greenhouses are also covered in full in the Soil and Roots book, and you can find more information about that on the site or on Amazon. Thanks so much, and enjoy the episode. Hey there, welcome to the Soil and Roots podcast, digging beneath the surface to uncover the hidden ideas that form us and the church and our culture. I'm Brian Fisher. This is episode 39, the Greenhouse episodes. Well, welcome back. So starting this week, we're introducing a brand new feature to the Soil and Roots podcast called the Greenhouse episodes. Now, here's what that means. As the Soil and Roots community has grown, a few old and new friends of mine have raised their hands and said they want to go deeper into the podcast, particularly the 3 primary problems and their solutions. So I've been having very regular, very rich conversations with these folks really over the past several months. We finally decided to physically get together on a regular basis to explore and discuss and even debate the podcast episodes and to begin to try to put some of the ideas into practice. A few months ago, my wife had a light bulb moment and said, "You should name this little group the Greenhouse." Brilliant. If our hearts are our roots and we're rooted in ideas and desires, what we call the soil, then the place and the community where we explore and grow and challenge and change is, in fact, a greenhouse. And so this little group of friends is just now starting to meet physically on a regular basis. They got me thinking that perhaps we might bring a bit of this greenhouse to the podcast so that all of us might benefit from it. So here's what we're going to try. Instead of me just monologuing every episode, we're going to pair each new episode with a greenhouse episode, where I sit down with a friend and we dialogue about the topic. I'll continue to present ideas and topics in one episode, and the following episode will be a casual conversation with a friend where we'll explore the ideas freely. Since many of you are asking questions that suggest I should spend more time on each session, these new greenhouse episodes will slow us down a bit, allow us to dig into the ideas, the 3 primary problems, Heartview, ICFs, in more detail, but do it in a way that's natural and hopefully more engaging for you. So for example, the last episode was about our heart's longings and desire for sitcom types of communities. So today, being our very first greenhouse episode, we're going to explore that topic more in depth, but in a natural conversation. With whom, you might ask? With a friend from the Greenhouse, who will now be the co-host of the podcast every other episode, the incomparable Kyle Moody.
Hey
there, Kyle.
What's up, B? How you doing?
I'm doing fine. Thanks for being here.
Oh, it's my pleasure to be here.
So you and I have known each other for several years, and you were actually part of the very first Soil and Roots study group where we began to explore some of these things, and that was a great time. That was back in 2022. But since then, you've been into this. So you and I have very regular conversation. You journal the episodes. You come loaded with questions. So I thought, being a member of this new little greenhouse group, you'd be perfect to be on the podcast. And I figured the sitcom episode was great because you have an affinity for sitcoms and media in general.
Oh, yes. Well, yeah, thank you so much for easing me into this because, yeah, this was definitely my cup of tea. I'm a huge nerd when it comes to Parks and Rec and Seinfeld and The Office. So you were, and I'll even throw in I Love Lucy, Andy Griffith. I mean, those are, yeah, we're going to go way back. So they're all very great examples of what this idea of an ICF is.
Yeah, so you and I have had some conversation offline, so help us understand sort of what hit you from the episode on sitcom community.
Yeah, I mean, because when we first started this way back in 2022, the thing that really resonated with me was how to become a disciple of Jesus. I'd heard about that growing up. I mean, I grew up in the church like you, and accepted Christ at a young age, but I always took my faith, looking back on it, I've taken my faith for granted. And I kept God at kind of a distance. And for my, early part of my life up until my early 30s, God was just, kind of like you mentioned in some of the other podcasts, that it was like fire insurance. I mean, I was growing in him a little bit, but it was very, very surface, and it was very transactional. It was just more of a casual kind of, oh yeah, he's there, I know, and I've known him, but there's nothing really intimate. When I started getting into my 30s and just really God put on a tug on my heart that, you know what, we need to get deeper. I want to go deeper with you. And it was wonderful. But it's a journey that we have to figure out how to become more like Jesus. And that's what really resonated with me when we first started doing this, and then listening to all the episodes. How do we become like Jesus? And it's different for everybody. And so that was a really cool thing. Specifically with episode 38, it was a wonderful way to crystallize what these immersive communities of formation are, and to see it through the lens of a pop culture reference made so much sense to me. Because I was like, oh, of course. Well, that's what an ICF is. That makes perfect sense. So then the big question that I had after that was, how do we start this? Because like you, I've been involved in small groups, community groups, Bible studies, things like that, which are great, but they never really came close to anything that looked like a sitcom group. And that's what I really long to have. And I think a lot of us do. And so my big question was, the thing that I've been wrestling with and talking to Jesus about was, what do we do to even get on the right path to get toward a true ICF?
Well, that's the question that I get from everyone, really since season 3 started. I think, at least with the folks that are part of the podcast community, recognize that in far too many instances, what we currently experience as church may not actually be the New Testament picture of church. Mm-hmm. And that's really an underlying theme of the entire effort. That when we say church, we typically mean a building where we have certain rituals and events that we go to that's separate and segmented from the rest of our lives. Mm-hmm. When in fact, the New Testament picture of church is far more community, far more transparent, far more relational than what we assume about church today. This is why, you could argue that when I talk about ICFs, I'm talking about church planting. Mm-hmm. But I don't use that phrase because church planting today, as good as it is about denominational or infrastructure expansion, not necessarily communities that are designed to actually form us to be more and more like Jesus.
Yeah. I mean, when you say church planting, the thought that pops into my head is a building. It's a group, it's a stereotypical church with the cross on the top. That's immediately what I think of.
Right. And so when I say, that's why I've fabricated this new term, ICF, because I'm trying not to immediately identify it with what you and I think of as church.
Right.
So when somebody says, well, how are these formed? And we're trying to answer that question as we move through season 3. It's not as easy as following a 12-point process to say, oh, well, here's how you go start a church. Those documents exist. What I'm saying is, no. This is about a community of like-minded people, work with the willing, who are getting together because they are desperate for Jesus. Mm-hmm. Because they want to reorder their lives to seek first the kingdom. They understand there's a cost to that, and there is. Mm-hmm. And they're willing to look different, behave different than what most of us typically experience in a quote-unquote church environment. So if there is a step 1 to how do we form it, it is finding people who are as desperate for Jesus as we are, and recognize that although the Western church has innumerable benefits and some wonderful things, we are missing a sense of deeper, transparent community that hopefully we can create or recreate in our institutional churches, but we just need to go find people who are desperate to be discipled. Does that make sense?
Oh, absolutely.
So the first step, if there is work with the willing. And that's what the Soil and Roots podcast is growing. We're seeing people raise their hands saying, you know what? I think we're missing something. I think the Christian walk is deeper. I think it's harder. I think there's more suffering than what we originally thought. But I also think we're missing that deep, intimate relationship that you see on sitcoms. So maybe the first step is just to pray through, who are my friends that are already in that spot? Who are my family members who are already in that spot? Maybe there are some folks in my small group that they have this inner angst, this longing that isn't being addressed or even recognized. And let's see if there's like 2 or 3 families, 2 or 3 friends that say, hey, maybe we should look at this, not necessarily in place of our modern church experience, but in addition to our modern church experience.
Yeah, and I mean, so many things that you're saying I'm tracking with, because for the longest time, what felt like the bulk of my adult life, I mean, I'm 46 now, and so for the large part of my adult life, I felt like I never had really close friends. I mean, that's what I was I had people that, I resonated with and people that I got along with, but I never really felt that idea of community. That's why when Michelle, my wife, and I started getting involved in community groups, that's what was so appealing about it. It was, oh man, I mean, these are church people, so obviously they've got to be great. And I think that's another pitfall that we fall into, is when we join these community groups, we automatically think, well, these are my people. But you and I had a conversation about, you can't force your people on you. You can't fabricate that. It has to happen organically. And that's what happened. I mean, you look at all these episodes of, on the sitcoms, I mean, they do come about organically. And sometimes, yeah, they're family, and which is great. It's just like the disciples. I mean, some of the disciples were family. And then they had these other people that came into that group, and they all went forward because they had a common purpose and they had a common desire to chase after Jesus. Obviously, the sitcoms don't have that, but they all did have a purpose, which was this idea of community. We're finding these people that are similar to us. Maybe they might have very different ideas, very different ways of life, but there's something there that connects them. There's something there that draws them together. And like you said, I think the key to this is a lot of prayer, a lot of patience, and a lot of vulnerability, and just waiting to see, okay, who can I track with? Who can I resonate with? Who can I get along with? And unfortunately, it takes time, And so I think that's, like you're saying, that's a key to starting this whole thing, is that openness, that vulnerability, and willing to explore. It's just an idea of exploring.
Yeah, and that's where I think we're so structured and systematized in the West that if we have an absence of a 12-step process to start something, that we sort of don't know what to do. I think there's some things underneath the surface here that work against forming ICFs. And one of them is this sort of Western underlying idea that we always have to be going. That the Christian life is always go, 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 go. Mm-hmm. That we need to go evangelize, nothing wrong with evangelism. That we need to be serving, nothing wrong with service. But I think we flip the pendulum too far. The reality is that the Christian life is about abiding, is about being in relationship, is about being in unity, is about being in intimate environments. And the outward manifestations of that happen somewhat naturally and organically. So, by the way, we wouldn't make this case about any other type of community. If you look at sports teams, for example, they live with each other. Professional sports teams, they do everything together so that they perform on the field. Mm-hmm. But there's hours and hours and hours and hours and hours of instruction and living together and eating together so that when they get on the field, they're performing, they're doing what they're designed to do. Mm-hmm. In Christianity today, we have it reversed. We have a go, 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 go. And why are you exhausted? Go, 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 serve, 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 serve. Well, why are you lonely? Mm-hmm. We have forgotten that the New Testament model is a community-first model. Mm-hmm. It is an intimate, transparent relationship with God, and then with each other, as messy and as screwed up as that can get, so that we have the ability to serve well. Not that we all don't experience times of loneliness, and then the question that we're going to wrestle with this, next episode quite a bit is, do we have access to that sort of time and intimacy and vulnerability in our local churches, or are we really putting on our Sunday best, showing up to hear a good sermon, going home and living fragmented lives where our church activities don't actually connect with the rest of our lives.
Yeah. And I think that's another big stumbling block and roadblock to forming these types of communities or these ICFs is when you go to church, everybody has this sort of preconceived notion that, well, everybody here is fine.
Right.
Everybody here knows what's going on. Everybody here is not struggling with anything, which is the complete opposite. We're all struggling with something. There's that great song that he says, I'm fine, no, I'm not. And it's just that idea that we have to put on this guise that we're all good. Because if we're struggling, then that means we're far away from Jesus, or we did something. I mean, it's written all over Job, and that's not true. It's not, because if you're struggling with something, it doesn't mean that God's got his heavy hand on you, and it doesn't mean that he's chastising you for something or you did something wrong. We struggle. We live in a sinful world, and so we're going to be exposed to that.
Well, and I think that's pressure, right?
Yeah.
When we go to church, we are expected to be the good guys.
Mm-hmm.
And
we are.
Whether we are or not, with our struggles, we show up. We need to look a certain way. We need to present a certain way. And unless you're involved in a specific, addiction counseling ministry or a marriage ministry where you kind of have to confess that you're not all right to be there. Otherwise, there is this underlying pressure that we are the good ones inside the church building. Now, we should be living holy lives. We should be hating sin more and loving Jesus more as we grow in our discipleship. The problem is when you look at church history and you look at spiritual disciplines, there are these constant themes of confession, of contrition. There are constant themes of this intimacy in relationships that leads to growth. And if all we're doing is showing up to a service for an hour and a small group for an hour, once every 2 weeks, especially if we're there with strangers, there is virtually no opportunity for us to engage in that sort of depth. And then we sit back and we wonder, well, do I think like Jesus more than I did 2 years ago? Well, how would I even know? Well, that's because we're not in environments that are actually designed to form us. We're in environments that are designed to educate us. And those are not usually the same things.
Yeah. Now, here's a question that I had for you, because you mentioned this, and when I was involved in a Bible study group, we talked a lot about what this meant, but I'm very curious to see your thoughts on this, because you mentioned abiding in Jesus, abiding in Christ. What does that mean? I think a lot of people, I didn't know what that meant for the longest time. So I'm curious, how would you, if somebody that did not know or that was really struggling with, abide in Jesus, what does that mean? What does that even, what does that look like? What does that look like to you? Like when you hear that and you say, I'm abiding in Jesus, what does that look like?
Yeah, there have been several good books written on this topic over the last really 10 years, but because, we're not the only ones to recognize there's spiritual exhaustion, there's deep loneliness, there is a sense of disconnectedness and fragmentation in the church. It is being in the presence of, it is resting in, it is, dare I say, relaxing in the presence of somebody else. When you're at home, you're in your abode, right? I mean, that's another word for house. You are in your safe place. You're with your comfortable relationships, your most intimate relationships. The word abide has a I'm at home sort of feel about it. Now, there's lots of churches that claim that they're homes, but again, there are certain characteristics of being at home that don't necessarily apply to what many people experience in a church. Being with somebody. Being in their presence, being in a safe, trusted environment, being home. The Western church doesn't propagate that well, primarily because it's an event-driven church. And going to an event is very different than going home.
Oh, yeah.
Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah. And I love that. I love the idea of it. It is about being home. I mean, I tell my kids that, abiding in Jesus is like hanging out with him. And it's not just when I go to church or when I'm in my small group. It's all the time. It's when I'm struggling with something or when I'm wrestling with something or when I'm celebrating something or when I'm confused about something, allowing Jesus to come in there. That's the thing that I've been realizing these last several years is he just longs so much to have an intimate relationship with us. And when we push in closer to him, we get filled in ways that we never could have imagined. And when we open ourselves up to that kind of relationship with him, it's absolutely amazing. And that's what we see in these sitcoms. I mean, because they are vulnerable with each other. They are open with each other. They are accepting of each other. And that's what, as an audience, when we're looking at this, I mean, think about it. Anytime that these characters struggle with something, that's what makes them more real. They're not perfect. They're not walking around with everything that they know how to do. Oh, okay. Ross can't get his leather pants on. I mean, that's hilarious. I mean, we've been in situations like that before.
Really?
And so
you've been in that situation?
Yes, well, not specifically that one.
That's a story for another time.
Yeah, that's another episode. But it's just, and how he struggles with that. And it just, that's what makes it real. And that's, I think, is what draws us in. That's what we need to have in these ICFs.
Yeah, and I think this goes back to the first season. I was having lunch with or breakfast with a pastor a couple weeks ago, and he made a great comment. He said, we tend to treat people like they're brains on sticks. That if we just give them information, that leads to transformation. Mm-hmm. And, he's a pastor who's deeply involved in spiritual formation, discipleship. So, he has quite a bit of understanding of how people work. If you go all the way back to season 1, actually, I think it's the first episode where I referenced James K.A. Smith. He said, look, we're not primarily thinkers. Mm-hmm. We're not even primarily believers. We're primarily desirers. Mm-hmm. We are primarily lovers. Mm-hmm. Now, you can't say those words without experiencing some sort of emotion or emotional context. And that's why in the last episode, I'm saying that the sitcom community and that all the ones that we reference are centered around a home. Mm-hmm. They're all centered around even The Office, which takes place in an office, or Parks and Rec, which primarily takes place in an office. That is home for that group. That's where they live together.
Oh, yeah. Michael Scott repeatedly refers to them as his family. I mean, this is our family. This is our home. Yeah.
Right. So you have this sense of who are the people that are going to love me, surround me, be in community with me, who are going to recognize and honor what I desire, what I long for, and help me move those things that I long for that are bad, that are part of the kingdom of darkness, and help me move those to the things that are good. Because this is where it gets, really anthropological. We desire certain things from both kingdoms, the kingdom of darkness and the kingdom of light. And if you look at any other type of formative community, really in human history, that community is the primary catalyst for forming our desires so that we don't desire things of darkness, but instead we desire things of light. Mm-hmm. So, it's hard to communicate this in a monologue, but, for example, so you and I have been friends for a while. Our friendship has been described by others as two old women sitting in a nursing home bickering, right?
Well, I prefer it to be like Felix and Oscar. That's what that's the analogy I'm more comfortable with.
I think that's kinder than what it actually is. But there are moments where you and I will sit together and our wives will be listening to the conversation, shaking their heads, wondering how it is that you and I even became friends, because we nip at each other and we sort of have this old biddy sort of relationship. Mm-hmm. Well, but there's obviously a familiarity there. Mm-hmm. There's a comfort level there, which you see reflected in the sitcom community all the time. That sort of relationship inevitably will grow deeper to where the funny, joking parts are wonderful and necessary for a relationship, but where you and I can have the formative conversations that actually move us to be more and more like Jesus.
Yeah.
But if the article that I cited in the podcast last episode is correct in that there's this preponderance of people sitting in churches who are desperately lonely, who feel like they need to look a certain way and act a certain way and say certain things, and who are in small groups maybe, but those small groups are a bunch of strangers that don't have any other sort of life with each other outside of that hour every 2 weeks, and yet we're trying to form these relationships. Their longings, right?
Yeah.
That's not abiding. That's fragmentation. That's disintegration. And what we're really trying to figure out here in this season is, can we fulfill that Christian, God-honoring longing of being in tight community inside church institutions? Because I think it does happen. I mean, I think there are churches that cultivate that. And or can it happen, and how does it happen outside of that institutional church? Can we still be the church if we're engaging in spiritual formation, but we're not actually in a church building? That is a difficult, pressing question. We're going to explore it more next episode. But ultimately, what I'm trying to paint this season is a picture of the characteristics of an ICF and answering some of the light how questions, but saying one way or the other, this is our longing. So whether or not we experience this and are able to be formed in a church institution, or something different or organic develops that may or may not be a part of a church that's going to freak some people out, the point is we need it. So how do we find it? And other people need it. The walking wounded desperately need to be in communities of safe people who are there for the purpose of being Christ to them.
Yep.
And that, to me, is an enigma. And I've been in the church since I was 6 years old. I've been in services 99% of the weeks that I've been alive, I would imagine. This has been elusive for me.
Yeah.
It's been elusive.
And I think it's like that for a lot of believers. I think what you said just now was, I think we have to be in the mindset of being willing to explore. We have to be willing to flip what we have perceived as church, or what we have perceived as, well, this is what you have to do in order to be a good quote unquote Christian. And I think that Jesus is not limited to one path. He's not limited to one direction. Their church can look like a lot of different things. And I think as long as we are attuned to him, we're abiding in him, we're hanging out with him, whatever he guides us to do, that right there, that for me, I think that is a key to all of this, is you have to be willing to go where he's pointing you to go. And you might not even know where you're going, but you just feel like, it's like you said with us. I mean, there is a what I would consider to be a very charming back and forth.
That's a very nice word.
Yes, it is.
It's a very delicate word.
When you were saying all that, I mean, it's just like Dwight and Jim. I mean, they started off, as mortal enemies. There's even a quote in episode 7 when Dwight is putting Cece, he's the only one that can get Cece to calm down, their daughter, Jim and Pam's daughter. And Pam says to Dwight, "Oh, we've always had this special relationship." And he says, "Yes, but you married my mortal enemy." And then Jim comes in and goes, "Well, see, I've always thought we've had this very charming back and forth." And at the end of The Office, they end up being really good friends. And you would never have suspected that from episode 1.
The fact that you can quote a specific episode of a sitcom is deeply disconcerting to me.
Oh,
I think we have to question how you're spending your time.
Okay, well, yeah. I'm listening to all these episodes that you're doing, and you're quoting all these books and scripture and everything. I'm like, okay, well, I can quote movies and sitcoms, so maybe I need to be jumping more into my Bible.
I can quote The Matrix. Dodge this. It's like the best line ever.
Whoa. Yeah.
I think it's back to the brains on stick analogy. If we believe. Again, I always feel like I have to qualify this. I'm a huge fan of theology and doctrine. I would consider myself to be an Orthodox evangelical Christian, not in a political sense, although I wouldn't take that for granted, but an evangelical meaning I believe in the accuracy, inerrancy of Scripture. Like I check all those boxes.
Yeah.
However, having worked in so many different Christian environments, there is an enormous difference between a person who intellectually agrees with doctrine. There can be a difference between that person and somebody who loves like Jesus. Not that the person who loves like Jesus doesn't have great doctrine. The difference is, does all this great doctrine and the things we're told that we need to believe, to intellectually agree to, travel the 18 inches to our heart in a way that manifests change in what we do? And I think the point you're making is we are transformed primarily through relationship. As creatures of longing, of desires, of loves, we are formed for darkness or for light primarily through relationships. And God primarily works through other people. It's not that we don't have a direct relationship with him and a tight intimacy with him, but for whatever reason, and this is shown throughout biblical history, God works through other people. And if we do not have other people in our lives who are on that same journey and who are weaving together in community, then we become malformed. We're not becoming more like Jesus. We might know more about Jesus. We might know more scripture. We might know more Bible verses. We might know more doctrine. But does that mean that we're going to desire and love like he loves more in 2 or 3 years? Those things are not necessarily the case. So there's an anthropological principle to this, which is if we accept that human beings are primarily creatures of longing, of desire, and we are handmade by a loving creator to be in relationship, where do we find relationships with like-hearted people who want to grow in Jesus and understand that? It's not so much about all the stuff we know. Mm-hmm. It's about who we are and how well we love. There's one book that I just finished that said the greatest indicator of a mature Christian, now think about this for a minute, is how well they love their enemies.
Wow.
So now think through that for myself. I've had enemies. Most Christians have had enemies at times. And in my case, and by enemies, I mean somebody who intentionally seeks to harm you. Mm-hmm. So a lot of people have had enemies. I've had enemies. How well do I love them? Now, love doesn't mean that I'm best friends with my enemies. It means that I've forgiven them. The debt that they owe me, I've canceled. Mm-hmm. And maybe the best way I can love them is to never speak with them again. And there are cases where that's accurate and biblical.
Right.
But the point is, how well am I loving I don't know if I've ever heard a sermon that said the point of you being in this building is that you learn to love your enemies better.
Yeah. Yep.
I don't think I've ever heard that.
Yeah.
I've heard, literally at this point, thousands of sermons, but I can't remember a time where somebody said, the point of being here is to become more and more repentant and to love your enemies more.
Yeah. Well, and I think the problem with that is, like you've said before in the past, is when you have this monologue or when you have this sermon, you could say something like that, but in order for it to really hit home and in order for it, what I think would be what Jesus intends from a sermon like that, would have to be a dialogue. You'd have to have conversations about what that looks like. You can't just have somebody say, you need to love your enemy better and quote a bunch of scripture and say, this is how you do it. And then that's it. That, I think, is the key to these ICFs, is it encourages that kind of back and forth. It encourages that sort of relationship. I mean, even in these sitcoms, there are echoes of Christ and echoes of Jesus and echoes of the truth and the kingdom that most people aren't even aware of.
Well, that gets back to the 3 primary problems, and that's why ICFs are designed, as we're incubating them and exploring them. There's nothing new. This is where when people ask me the how question, I sort of want to say, well, just go back and read the 4 Gospels. That's where you're going to find them. And then Acts, because I think those 5 books are where the patterns of ICFs are actually formed. So back to your original question, how do they get formed? I think prayer is essential. I think finding people who are desperate for Jesus, whom you already have some sort of affiliation with, or that God brings in some sort of interesting way into the mix. So you talked about the 12 disciples. There's some family relationships there, and then there's some oddball outliers that come into that group that Jesus himself calls for, reasons of his own. In our world, I would argue that as we begin to explore the formation of ICFs in a church or not in a church, that they should be groups that are somewhat naturally inclined to be with each other, but who recognize some amount of loneliness, disconnection, lack of integration in their own hearts and in their own lives, and are willing to say, we will find the time. This is the other big objection that most people raise. I don't have the time. I don't know how we don't have the time.
Right.
Again, I've made the argument that we form ICFs all the time. We just don't form them for our spiritual growth. We form them for lots of other things.
Right.
So how passionate, how desperate, I keep using that word, for Jesus are we? So if you live in a neighborhood, and maybe if your friend doesn't go to your church, or maybe doesn't go to church at all, or maybe you have a couple families that you guys get together with casually, but you sense there's something deeper. There's a longing there. There's a desire to experience the richness and the abundance of the Christian life. that might be the initial group. Maybe it's 3 people, maybe it's 8 people, maybe it's 10. I think smaller is better. But again, as we continue to explore ICS from a New Testament standpoint, they look a lot different than what most of us experience, and they have characteristics to them that are dissimilar to what some of us have in a traditional church. Not to say that that's universal,
Right.
not to say that that's every church. I'm not making that claim, but I think this is a profound struggle for us as individuals. I am deeply concerned that there are untold numbers of wounded, hurting, lonely Christians who desperately need to remember the kingdom, to solve the discipleship dilemma, and to be in immersive communities and fill the formation gap, who have no ability to do that, no opportunity to do that. And they still might be sitting in a church service every Sunday.
Yeah.
In a Western culture that is continuing to see extraordinary harm, suicide, relational challenges, abuse, all the things that we all see on TV, if there's one body who should emulate intimate, tight community and loving each other and growing each other, it should be people who claim to follow Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
And I think in some regard that's happening, but an immersive community is going to appear far more radical with every passing year in the West, as the West continues to be more segmented and more fragmented.
Mm-hmm.
And so wouldn't it be amazing if ICFs began to spring up in local churches or in families or in neighborhoods or in other means, just friends getting together, groups of families getting together, and they're saying, we're going to commit more time than once a week and once every 2 weeks, and we're going to test heart listening, confession, celebration, right?
Yeah.
Joy.
Yeah.
And we're going to come together and we're going to explore scriptures. We're going to debate. We're going to dissent. We're going to have arguments. We're going to work this stuff out. But this becomes a new rhythm for how we live in Christian community. Can you just imagine the impact on everybody else that would have? Like, how well these Christians love each other, right? Isn't that the exclamation from the first century church?
Yeah.
How amazing is it we just love each other? And so I don't have all the answers, and we're working through these things together, and I'm trying to describe ICFs without necessarily making a prescription for them. But as we go through the rest of the season, there's plenty of more surprises and some radical ideas coming.
Oh, I love it. I love it. It's just about being willing to go on the journey and being adventurous and allowing Jesus to point us in the direction that he takes us. And it can look very different for different people. And I think that's beautiful. It's awesome.
Awesome. Hey, Kyle, thanks for being here.
Oh, I love it. Can't wait for the next one.
We're going to see you again in 2 episodes. Boy, the next one, we're going to have more than enough to talk about.
Yes.
I've been writing it and wrestling with it for several weeks. So that's going to be a very interesting conversation.
Awesome.
Hey, thanks for tuning in today. So appreciate it. I hope you enjoy this new greenhouse format. Again, it'll be every other episode. If you have questions that you'd like us to discuss or debate, you can always email me at fish@soilandroots.org, fish@soilandroots.org. If you love this format, love to hear about it. If you like Kyle more than me, don't bother emailing it. So just
Feel free to email me, though, whenever I get an email address.
What's your email? Fishy? If you want more information, you can go to soilandroots.org. And as always, you can email me. Although if you want to talk to Kyle, I'll forward your email at fish@soilandroots.org. We'll see you next time.